Why does it matter to keep up to date with the scholarship on religion and history? I recently received a comment on one of my videos asking why I consider the work of a 21st century book to be any more credible than a 1st century book on the life of Jesus. Well, why do we find modern biographies of King Arthur to be more credible than medieval story books about his life? There are a few reasons, all pointing to the value of higher criticism, and not only will these be useful to know in answering this question, but they will also play a crucial role in my upcoming series on the Gospels. First of all, the concern for an objective, well-sourced and myth-free history was not commonplace until more recent times. This rigorous standard was very scarce during the medieval ages, and it was practically unheard of in the 1st century. The Jewish historian Josephus is one of the best-known historians of the 1st century, and yet his claim that Alexander the Great visited the Jerusalem temple is overwhelmingly rejected by modern historians. Not only does the story lack corroborating evidence, but it seems like just the sort of thing a Jewish author might uncritically accept because it glorifies the Jewish temple by having one of the most powerful men of the ancient world come to pay his respects. It was perfectly normal for ancient historians to report rumors and traditions along with facts and written records, particularly if they served the author's purpose. Writing materials were expensive in the ancient world, and few but the upper class knew how to write. When someone decided to write a history, it was often because they had strong opinions they wanted to communicate, and this was frequently done with focus on entertainment, like in an epic or poem, so as to make the work more successful. Thucydides became such an influential historian precisely because he deviated from this norm and sought a more objective method. But for many centuries, history has been conducted more like a survey than a careful investigation. Modern historians hold to source criticism principles like multiple attestation, independent testimony, and other criteria that were of little to no concern to 1st century historians like Josephus. These principles are important because they help to argue against the odds of fabrication, hallucination, faulty memory, and general inaccuracy. In 64 CE, the Great Fire of Rome burned for 6 days and destroyed 3 districts, leaving several others severely damaged. Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio report this event, and there are said to have been additional accounts that have not survived. This is a multiply attested claim, and although the sources we have are not primary sources, they do appear to have relied on primary sources that were independent of one another. Imagine if the Great Fire of Rome could only be traced back to one source, maybe 40 or 50 years after the event. This would not necessarily be reason to doubt the fire ever happened, but it would be cause for suspicion, much more so than with the multiply attested independent evidence we do have. It would be unusual for such a massive and destructive event to have gone unreported by other historians, and if a possible motive could be inferred from the single claim, like the author having a personal hatred for Nero, it would make things yet more complicated. The more independent sources we have for a claim, the better, and in addition to this, we can examine the context and content of the claim to see what bias it has. Claims that are made with relatively little vested interest on the part of the author, or that may even work against the author's personal interest, are less suspicious than claims that play into a strong bias. This doesn't mean biased statements are entirely untrustworthy, but it does call for a more skeptical approach. It should also be pointed out that these criteria are more like guidelines and principles than rules, and so they should always be considered along with reason and a careful appreciation of a source's context. By themselves they serve very little use, but taken all together they can constitute a stronger argument. Perhaps the most important method that modern historians may use is the argument to the best explanation proposed by C.B. McCulloch. McCulloch lists 7 conditions that serve to argue for the probability that an explanation is, in fact, the best explanation available. Among these conditions are explanatory power, explanatory scope, minimal disconfirmation by other accepted beliefs, and so on. When used properly, the argument to the best explanation incorporates the other criteria, like multiple attestation and independent testimony, and puts forward a theory or explanation that best accounts for the available evidence. As an additional note, Richard Carrier has very recently published a book arguing that historical methods should recognize Bayes' theorem as its basis. There are certainly some benefits I could see coming from this, such as calculating more precise probabilities for historical claims, but since I have not yet read Carrier's book, I cannot comment further. If Carrier's work proves successful, it will integrate the best of historical method, as I have discussed here, and omit the gray areas and less effective criteria, like those of embarrassment and dissimilarity. Thus, one reason modern histories may be more reliable than ancient documents is because most historians today use better methods capable of a more objective analysis of sources. Of course, we should always check the evidence presented by an author, and not simply assume they're up to date. I don't trust modern scholarship because it's modern. I trust it because it has better methods on hand to examine the evidence that is available to us. On a related note, a second reason is that modern scholarship has collected additional evidence that was not available to ancient historians. Today, a scholar has millions of resources at her fingertips thanks to the printing press and the internet, but first-century historians undoubtedly had limited access to materials. Even if they had the opportunity to peruse the Roman archives or other collections of resources, we have discovered more through archaeology since that time, and there's just no way ancient collections could have housed a fraction of the wealth of material we have now. Not only have we learned better ways of interpreting sources since the first century, but we've also exponentially expanded our available resources. This expansion of our knowledge also goes beyond the field of history, which brings us to a third reason. Modern scholarship has the evidence of science to check against historical claims. In the Theban necropolis stands two large statues built during the reign of Amenhotep III, referred to as the Colossi of Memnon by the ancient Greeks. Strabo was the first of several historians to report hearing a strange noise occasionally coming from the statues. The name Memnon means ruler of the dawn, and because the mysterious sound seems to have often been heard during the dawn hours, it was believed that the noise was the voice of Memnon calling out in response to the greeting of his mother Eos, the dawn goddess. Science has given modern historians a better understanding of this phenomenon. The statues are hollow and also have fissures in the granite, which would allow for air heated by the morning sun to escape through them, producing a sound similar to the noise we hear when wind blows through windows that are slightly cracked open. What was once attributed to the supernatural turns out to be a case of simple physics. But even when scientific explanations are not so obvious, modern scholars still have a greater knowledge of science to inform their conclusions, which can, at the very least, mean that they propose reasonable natural causes where ancient scholars would not have done so. None of this should be taken to mean that all ancient sources are necessarily inferior. Modern scholarship is built on the foundation of ancient sources, and so these histories from antiquity are invaluable to us. However, we have found more effective ways of interpreting sources since the ancient times. In fact, we should hold all sources to the standards of reason and evidence, whether they are from antiquity or modernity. Generally, though, ancient sources should be viewed with more skepticism because most of them do not meet the concerns for accuracy that we have today. This is not Western elitism or anything of the sort, but is merely acknowledgement of the simple truth that knowledge changes as time changes. If there is reason to be skeptical in how we approach ancient histories, how much more reason is there to be skeptical in our approach to ancient sources that were not written as histories? Some apologists argue that the Gospels are biographies, and yet many scholars like Mary Lefkowitz have shown that Greco-Roman biographies were just as likely to contain fiction as Greco-Roman histories. As I said at the beginning of this video, the concern for objective, well-sourced, and myth-free history is a relatively recent phenomenon. The Gospels have been compared to many different genres of the ancient world, but they do not show clear signs that they were intentionally written in these genres, nor do they conform in many ways to the standards of these genres. In my forthcoming series, the very first thing we will look at is what a Gospel is, and how it may be a genre all its own. And hopefully this video has helped to demonstrate why scholarship is a necessary component to Gospel studies. Even if the Gospels are not histories, it's important to know the historical context they emerged from, and simply reading them at face value will not give the full picture.